Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
Back in September 2021, a 42-year-old Manny Pacquiao officially announced his retirement from boxing. His illustrious professional career, in which he became an 8-weight world champion, was over. This announcement came about a month after his 12-round unanimous decision loss to Yordenis Ugas. But just when he thought he was out, they pulled him back in. And he will of course be back to championship action next Saturday as he challenges for Mario Barrios' WBC welterweight title at the ripe old age of 46. Pacquiao was already the oldest man to ever win the welterweight world title, as he won the Super WBA title from Keith Thurman by a split decision back in 2019 at the age of 40. So if Pacquiao defeats Barrios, he will be beating his own record of becoming the oldest ever welterweight champion, and extending that record to the point where it will likely be unbreakable. Of course, being 6 years older now than he was when he last won a welterweight world title fight. A win over Mario Barrios will also deem Manny Pacquiao the second oldest fighter to ever win a world title across any weight class, as he is currently already older than George Foreman was when he won the unified heavyweight titles off of Michael Moorer. Foreman was 45 at the time, so yeah, that's who Pacquiao will be overtaken in second place. And Pacquiao will be second to Bernard Hopkins as the oldest man to ever win a world title. Hopkins won the WBA light heavyweight title from Babut Shemenov in a unification fight when he was 49 years old. So to get to the ins and outs of these oldest world champion records quickly, it gets a bit complicated, as there is the discussion of both how old you were when you won the title and how old you were when you lost it. For instance, you can win a world title when you're 39, which means you became a world champion at 39, but if you lose it when you're 40, then you were still a world champion at 40 years old, of course. So Manny Pacquiao was a good 9 months older than George Foreman was when Foreman beat Moorer. So yes, Manny Pacquiao will become the second oldest man to win a world title if he beats Barrios. But technically, George Foreman was a world champion until he was 48. He actually got stripped of both of his WBA and IBF heavyweight titles when he was 46, but he didn't lose the lineal title until he was 48, so that's if we're counting the lineal title. So Pacquiao would have to hold on to the WBC welterweight title for a good while to become the second oldest world champion of all time, full stop, as opposed to the second oldest to win a world title, if anyone cares about that record. But if you're not counting the lineal title here and only, governed belts, then Pacquiao will be the second oldest ever world champion, full stop, at the point of beating Barrios, as he's already older than Foreman was when Foreman got stripped of the IBF title for not going ahead with his ordered rematch of Axel Schultz after winning a controversial decision over him in a title defense. And Foreman already got stripped of the WBA title a good while before that for not fighting Tony Tucker, his WBA mandatory at the time, of course. And as for Pacquiao potentially being the number one oldest world champion of all time after beating Mario Barrios, and that's if he beats Barrios of course, well, he'd have to hold on to that WBC title for a good bit over 3 years, or win a world title again in over 3 years time after this Barrios fight, and that's not going to happen, is it? Hopkins' record ain't been beaten anytime soon, so let's just worry about the potential of Pacquiao becoming the second oldest ever world champ. The fact that Pacquiao is even in the conversation with the top two oldest world champions of all time, George Foreman and Bernard Hopkins, is astonishing though, because Manny Pacquiao would be doing it at welterweight, but Bernard Hopkins did it at light heavyweight and George Foreman did it at heavyweight. Pacquiao winning a world title at 40, considering all the circumstances, is great already, but Pacquiao's circumstances and how they differentiate from that of George Foreman and Bernard Hopkins is the reason why it seems kind of unfeasible for Pacquiao to do it again at 46, but why it would also be such a great feat if he does pull it off. So it's no secret that in the lighter weight classes, it becomes more and more difficult to fight at a higher level the older you get, just due to the speed of every movement. But let alone Hopkins and Foreman doing it in heavier weight classes, both of their styles were also more sustainable for fighting on in their old ages. In the second phase of George Foreman's career, he stuck behind a solid jab and relied on minimal movement. He managed to be effective while being quite static. He still had a good chin, and of course he still carried his power with age, and it was that power which allowed him to come back and miraculously KO Michael Moorer with one right hand in the 10th round while being behind in the fight. And Bernard Hopkins now, he was a cagey veteran who was just out here schooling guys. He would literally do what you would call old man in someone. But as for Manny Pacquiao, he ain't old man in no one. He relied heavily on athleticism to outbox his opponent. Tremendous foot speed to dart in and out of range, he'd create angles, and he also had the hand speed to piece guys up with 6, 7, 8 punch combos. So yeah, he has an unorthodox style that relies on athleticism. He still relied on that athleticism in his late 30s and early 40s, and did so to a good level of success. and his reliance on athleticism is what made it so amazing that he could do what he did to an undefeated reigning world champion Keith Thurman when he was 40 years old. But 46 now, that's something else, mate. Now, when George Foreman defeated Michael Moorer in 1994, he became the oldest fighter to ever win a world title across any weight at that time, as he was over 6.5 years older than Archie Moore was when he won the light heavyweight title in 1952. So Archie Moore was the record holder as the oldest boxer to win a world title for a long time before Foreman won the honour. And Bernard Hopkins now, he actually beat Foreman's record of being the oldest man to win a world title when he won the light heavyweight title from Jean Pascal in 2011 at the age of 46. That was a unanimous decision win in his rematch of Pascal, as Hopkins drew with Pascal the first time around. Hopkins would have beaten the record as the oldest boxer to win a world title if he got the nod against Pascal the first time around, but he would have just been 38 days older than Foreman was when Foreman beat Moorer. But by the time of the rematch, Hopkins was over half a year older than Foreman was when he beat Moorer. Oh, when he was 46 in the rematch as opposed to being 45, his age in the first Pascal fight. But none of that would matter, as Hopkins would extend the record as the oldest man to win a world title in 2014 when he won that unification with Shemenov as a 49-year-old. Now, another major difference between the Manny Pacquiao of 2025 and the George Foreman of 1994 and the Bernard Hopkins of 2011 and 2014 is that Hopkins and Foreman were both more active fighters at those points in time. They weren't returning from a 4-year layoff like Pacquiao is and walking back into world title shots. Well, to be fair, George Foreman challenged Michael Moorer off of a loss and a layoff of a year and 5 months, but that's way less than half the time Pacquiao has been out for since his loss to Ugas in 2021. And Bernard Hopkins now, he was just fully active when he beat Pascal in 2011 and when he beat Shemenov in 2014. Now, I know George Foreman is famous for making a big return after taking several years out of the ring. He had a decade out of the ring, but that was from 1977 to 1987. George Foreman became fully active again in 87 and actually picked up 24 consecutive wins from that point until 1991. Then in 1991 he would challenge Evander Holyfield for the undisputed heavyweight title. George Foreman fell short and lost a 12-round unanimous decision to the undisputed champ in a good effort. Foreman then went on a 3-fight winning streak after the loss to Holyfield and then challenged for the vacant WBO title against the 24-year-old Tommy Morrison in 1993. A win against Morrison would have made the 44-year-old George Foreman the oldest man to ever win the world heavyweight title. Or he would have been the oldest to become a world champion all round because he was already quite a bit older than Archie Moore was when Moore won the light heavyweight title in 52. But the thing is, we're talking about a WBO title fight in 1993. The WBO wasn't unanimously renowned as a legit world title back then. Far from it, as you would know if you heard how they were talking about the WBO on the very broadcast of the Tommy Morrison vs George Foreman fight. The HBO broadcast, that is. But none of that would matter at all in the end anyway, as Tommy Morrison comprehensively outboxed George Foreman over the 12 rounds to win quite a wide unanimous decision and pick up that WBO belt. And believe you me, Morrison wasn't known for outboxing guys like that. So great performance from him, but this wasn't a good look for Foreman, let's say that. After this loss to Morrison, people did kind of think the 44-year-old George Foreman was done for. There didn't look to be much of a way back to world title contention for Big George. But then after being rather inactive, he would come back for a shot at Michael Moore's newly won unified WBA and IBF heavyweight titles in what would have been a voluntary defence for Moorer. And of course Foreman went on to knock out Moorer to win the titles and make history. So yeah, although Manny Pacquiao's world title shot in his old age is nothing like the oldest ever world champion Bernard Hopkins, who won a unification at 49 while being an active champion, I suppose Pacquiao's situation isn't awfully dissimilar to that of George Foreman. Both guys were coming off of losses in fights which they kinda looked to be done for, and then they walked straight back into title shots. Again, of course, Foreman's layoff was way shorter than Pacquiao's, Foreman was a bit younger than Pacquiao is now, and Foreman was in a weight class that's easier to have success in at an older age. But in a sense, the Tommy Morrison fight for George Foreman is like what the Yordenis Ugas fight is for Manny Pacquiao. Well, that only rings true if Pacquiao actually goes on to beat Mario Barrios, like how Foreman went on to beat Michael Moorer off of the Morrison loss and the layoff. So as for Manny Pacquiao's loss to Yordenis Ugas back in August 2021, well, Pacquiao was competitive in there, but it was a convincing loss, much like Foreman's loss to Morrison. But here's the thing, that Ugas fight in itself was off of a layoff. Pacquiao hadn't fought in over 2 years since beating Keith Thurman in 2019. So Pacquiao's loss to Ugas was off of an even longer layoff than Foreman's layoff between the loss to Morrison and the win over Michael Moorer, reinforcing how unique Pacquiao's circumstances would be compared to the other guys on the oldest world champions list if he does go on to defeat Mario Barrios. So that WBA super title that Manny Pacquiao won off of Keith Thurman in 2019, he was stripped of that in early 2021. The WBA tend to take long to strip guys, so Pacquiao would have actually still been a world champion at 42 years old. But when he was stripped, the WBA regular champion Ugas was upgraded to super champion. So this Ugas fight in August 2021, Pacquiao's last pro fight to date, of course, was Pacquiao's chance to regain that WBA belt. But the thing is, Pacquiao was meant to be challenging for Errol Spence's unified WBC and IBF welterweight titles, but Spence had to pull out of his fight with Pacquiao on 11 days' notice due to an injury. So your Dennis Ugas, who was meant to be defending his WBA belt against Fabian Maidana on the undercard of that big unified title fight between Pacquiao and Spence, stepped up to the plate to main event against Pacquiao and defend his WBA belt against the legend on 11 days' notice. So as for Manny Pacquiao's not so great performance against Ugas, yes, Pacquiao did have to fight Ugas on very short notice. He was preparing to fight a southpaw in Errol Spence, but he had to fight the orthodox Ugas instead. And yes, your Dennis Ugas was preparing for the fellow orthodox Fabian Maidana, but coming from the Cuban school of boxing, Ugas would have came up in the game mainly sparring and having amateur bouts against southpaws, because most Cubans are southpaws, of course. So we're talking about an orthodox guy in your Dennis Ugas who is particularly well schooled in combating southpaws, not like those other orthodox guys who are like, oh, I struggle with southpaws, it's a nightmare. No problem for Ugas, mate. So this might have been the worst type of late replacement opponent for Pacquiao. Typically, the weapons that are known to be effective against southpaws are the straight right hands to the head and body, and also the right hook to the body, as there's a lot of surface area to aim at with that punch on a southpaw. And Ugas was effective with those tools against Pacquiao, but he was also particularly effective with the jab and the right hook to the head against Manny Pacquiao. And he was a lot more handy with the jab than most orthodox guys tend to be against a world-class southpaw such as Pacquiao. Ugas also stood in the firing line of Manny Pacquiao's famous straight left hand, but was still able to defend that left hand fairly consistently. And being sort of right in front of Pacquiao more so than others would be, allowed for Ugas to go for more attacks of his own. And again, he was likely able to do this due to his experience against southpaws. But orthodox southpaw dynamics aside, in regards to age, the topic of this video, Pacquiao didn't look awful in there at all. He was on his toes and moving around a lot less than he was against Keith Thurman 2 years prior for sure, but he still seemed in good shape. He was throwing punches in bunches and he had decent punch resistance. But yeah, due to the lack of movement, we could say this was a lesser version of Pacquiao than the one who fought Keith Thurman. This was probably due to age and probably inactivity. And inactivity can be terrible for older guys. They've got to stay active. Keith Thurman himself recently said in an interview on Mill City Boxing that Pacquiao doesn't look good coming off of inactivity, which is why we saw a better version of Pacquiao against himself than we did against your Dennis Ugas. And Thurman pointed out how Pacquiao was active and on a decent run at the point of fighting him, having defeated both Lucas Matisse and Adrian Broner within the last year at that point in time. But against Ugas, he hadn't fought at all for 2 years. I mean, look at the oldest ever world champion Bernard Hopkins. He stayed active and held it down at world level until he was 49 years old. He lost his unified title to Sergey Kovalev by a decision at 49, but that's no shame at all. But after a layoff of just under 2 years, he fights Joe Smith Jr., a step down from his recent opposition, and the then 51-year-old Hopkins gets stopped for the first time in his 65-fight pro career against Joe Smith. So it's the old age mixed with the inactivity. So now against Mario Barrios, we're talking about a way older and way more inactive Manny Pacquiao, which is why, again, this comeback is so unique and makes it even more questionable that the WBC ranked Pacquiao so they could sanction this fight, one might say. So the Ugas fight in 2021 was Pacquiao's last pro fight, but he's had 2 exhibitions since. He beat up some martial artist in late 2022, but that guy clearly couldn't box one bit, and Pacquiao was over 2.5 years younger than he is now at that point. But the more relevant exhibition was the one against the MMA fighter Rukia Anpo around this time last year. So a 45-year-old Pacquiao we're talking about here. And Pacquiao famously looked terrible in that exhibition against Anpo. Some could say that Pacquiao clearly showed his age in that one, actually looked washed up and even far removed from the version of himself that lost to Ugas. And some might say on the flip side that Pacquiao just looked like he didn't train for that fight. He wasn't really in shape, but he is now of course getting into crazy shape for Mario Barrios. We would hope the latter is true, that Pacquiao would just look so bad in that fight because he was in bad shape, so this Pacquiao versus Barrios fight can at least be somewhat competitive. Because that version of Manny Pacquiao we saw in the Anpo fight, if we get that version of Pacquiao against Barrios, let's be honest, Barrios is pretty much guaranteed to win. On that note, Mario Barrios is of course a sizable favourite over Manny Pacquiao in this fight, simply due to Pacquiao being so old and inactive, and those factors are enough for me to personally predict Mario Barrios to win this fight. I'm not putting a penny on Barrios because I'm not betting against Pacquiao, but I'm not putting money on Pacquiao either, let me just say that. But Pacquiao isn't a massive underdog here at all, and that's not just because he's Manny Pacquiao, it's also because he's not exactly come up against one of the greatest welterweight champions we've seen in recent times, is he? I won't go into full detail now, as I already went into detail about this in my The Welterweight Division Fell Off video, which I'll link in the top of the description and put on the end screen. But basically, this fight is almost a thing where if Pacquiao is going to come back and beat any world champion at this age, it's the guy who doesn't exactly impress on the big stage. the guy who got stopped by a super featherweight in Tank Davis, the guy who got whooped by Keith Thurman, who was inactive for over 2.5 years at that point, and the guy who in his first defense of the full WBC welterweight title on the biggest stage possible, the undercard of Mike Tyson versus Jake Paul, went life and death with Abel Ramos and fought to a 12-round draw. Now there's more to Mario Barrios than those blemishes on his record, of course, which I speak about in that welterweight division fell off video, so again, please do check that out. Now, I'm okay with the existence of this Pacquiao vs Barrios fight. That welterweight division fell off video was my reaction to the making of this fight, but that wasn't a negative reaction to Pacquiao's return in itself. It's his choice as a man to come back, and I'm excited to potentially see him make history. I wasn't going to use his return and his immediate title shot as a chance to cry about the WBC, because that gets real boring, don't it? But the fact that we're in a position where this fight is acceptable is just an indictment of the lack of depth in the welterweight division. And the lack of depth on this division is something that's been playing on my mind for like maybe a year and a half. And I did that video before Boots officially went up to 54, so yeah, it's actually way worse now. But yeah, the Pacquiao-Barrios fight in itself. Again, who are we to judge the fact that Pacquiao's been pulled back into boxing at this age? And it's not like there's anyone you lot would have rather seen fight Barrios for the WBC welterweight title, is there? Devin Haney is the WBC #1 at welterweight, but he's fighting Brian Norman Jr. for the WBO belt, which is the best fight possible in the division. And let's be honest, Barrios was not going to be in a world title unification anyway, was he? And that's nothing to do with the WBC. You can't mandate someone to unify. There's literally no consequences for ducking unification. I'm definitely not defending the WBC here at all, and I have my issues with them too, but using this Pacquiao return just as a means to moan about the WBC is just boring and tiresome in my opinion, as unpopular as my opinion may be here. Because I understand that we need to speak out against stuff that we disagree with, but let's be honest, someone with literally 1,000 times the amount of influence as me can say all they want about the WBC, but it's not going to change anything, so imagine me, like, what's the point in me even having a bitch and moan? Just back to the oldest world champion record stuff before I close out here. So I've spoken a lot about George Foreman and Bernard Hopkins in this video, mainly George Foreman, as Pacquiao will be overtaking him as the second oldest fighter to ever win a world title if he beats Barrios. And of course B-Hop is the guy who he'd be second to. But of course, the age that Pacquiao was when he became the oldest guy to win a welterweight world title against Foreman, he was over 5 years younger than Foreman was when he beat Mora. So although Pacquiao's upcoming fight with Mario Barrios would have him in second over Foreman as the oldest guy to win a world title, because right now Pacquiao has only won a world title as old as 40, with his last pro win over Keith Thurman 6 years ago, as it stands, there are a couple of guys between Manny Pacquiao and George Foreman on the list of the oldest guy to win a world title, that being Cornelius Brundage, who did it at super welterweight, and Fulani Malinga, who did it at super middleweight. So if Manny Pacquiao defeats Mario Barrios, he'll be overtaking Fulani Malinga and Cornelius Brundage on the oldest to win a world title list, as well as George Foreman, but as it stands, Pacquiao was only the 5th oldest to win a world title. In terms of the list of the oldest to be a world champion, it does get a little bit more complicated. We'll consider January 2021, when Manny Pacquiao was considered WBA champion in recess at 42 years old, as the last time Manny Pacquiao was a world champion. Now the current WBA middleweight champion Erislandy Lara is already older than Pacquiao was when Pacquiao was named WBA champion in recess. Current WBC cruiserweight champion Badou Jack, there's actually a case for him winning a world title at an older age than, some of the other guys I've already mentioned, but that, we don't want to go on for an hour here. When Vitaly Klitschko retired in 2013 and officially gave up his WBC heavyweight title, he was a good few months older than Pacquiao was when he was made WBA champion in recess back in 2021. So as it stands now, before Pacquiao versus Barrios, Vitaly Klitschko has been our oldest sitting world champion than Manny Pacquiao ever was. Then you got Archie Moore, going back to when I said if you count the lineal title then George Foreman was technically a world champion until he was 48 years old. Well, so was Archie Moore actually. He was also 48 when he was still the lineal light heavyweight champion. So in that sense, if Pacquiao beats Barrios, he will only be the 4th oldest person to be a world champion of all time, and will still have quite a bit of work to do to overtake Archie Moore and George Foreman. And quickly back to the age that someone was when they won a world title, if we count the WBA regular title, I'm telling you there's all these catches, then Virgil Hill was actually the 3rd oldest man to ever win a world title, below Bernard Hopkins and George Foreman, as Virgil Hill won the WBA regular cruiserweight title when he was 42 years old. As I've said a few times, Pacquiao is of course the oldest to ever win a welterweight world title at 40 years old, and if he does it at 46, it would be shades of the oldest ever world champion Bernard Hopkins in terms of extending records. If Hopkins becoming the oldest man to ever win a world title at 46 weren't enough, why not extend it and win a world title at 49 to make the record unbreakable? Oh, and in that fight with Babit Shemainov when he became the oldest world champion ever, he didn't just become the oldest man to win a world title and remain the oldest ever sitting world champion full stop, he also became the oldest unified world champ and the oldest guy to win a unification fight, of course. So he just set these untouchable records there. Now Manny Pacquiao being the oldest welterweight world champion at 40, Can that record be beat? It'll be a tough ask, and it is a very solid record, but beating it is more than possible. An Echo Esserman maybe? Just got into welterweight title contention now and he's already 36. It's not likely that he will win a world title at 40, but it is possible. Or maybe if the 37-year-old Bud Crawford eventually moved back down to 147 or something, but I doubt it. But again, there are chances out there of someone eventually becoming a welterweight world champion at 40. But 46 now? Forget about it. No one is touching that record. Nobody is going to become a welterweight world champion at 46. Pacquiao's fight with Barrios is by far the best chance there'll ever be of us seeing a 46-year-old welterweight world champion. Pacquiao breaking his own record by 6 years would be a boss move. And back to Bernard Hopkins beating his own record of becoming the oldest man to win a world title. Well, he didn't extend his record of being the oldest man to win a world title for the first time in the Shimeno fight. He actually extended it for the first time when he beat Tavoris Cloud for the IBF light heavyweight title at 48, breaking his own record by 2 years then. So let's say B-Hop never extended his record by 2 and then by 3 years after beating Pacquiao. Manny Pacquiao himself would actually be able to take the record as the oldest guy to win a world title across any weight class if he beats Barrios. So I guess Hopkins proved that extending the record is worth the while. Seeing as we're talking about a Pacquiao today, for those who haven't already, please check out my documentary on Manny Pacquiao's brother Bobby Pacquiao. I really thought I'd make it out of the hood with that one, but the number of views in it is pretty abysmal. As always, for those of you who have already seen it, I appreciate you guys greatly. I couldn't do it without the real ones. But yeah, I did just expect a video like that to get a bit more reach, and I will not stop shamelessly plugging it due to how hard I worked on it and how many weeks of my life I took out to make a video about Bobby Pacquiao. Also check out the welterweight division fell off video too. Do leave your predictions for Manny Pacquiao versus Mario Barrios in the comments down below, and you've been listening to O.M.E Boxing.